Announced policy of January the 5th, 2011. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. King, for 30 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The gentleman from Iowa is pleased to be recognized to address you here on the floor of the House, and I want to express my disappointment in the gentleman who spoke before me. I usually come here to pick up my material for a rebuttal, and as I listened to you talk about your affection for the Peace Corps, I didn't come up with a single thing that I seek to rebut here tonight, so I'll go off on the subject matter that I came to address, Madam Speaker, and that is the situation where we are in this country today with debt and deficit and the growth in government and the things that we must do to turn this country back around and put it on the right track. This House here this afternoon voted to pass a continuing resolution that has within it an aggregate of about $4.1 billion in cuts over a 2-week period of time, that if you multiply or extrapolate that out to the end of the fiscal year, it comes in that neighborhood of about $61 billion in cuts, which arguably holds the reductions in place, but it did specifically go in and make the cuts in areas where the president had recommended those cuts. It dialed down the contention and tried to find a way to find a solution and a resolution. A list of the president's recommendations I have, but I don't think I'm going to take the time or the trouble, Madam Speaker, to read them into the record. I'll just say that it suffices to show that a number in the neighborhood of $2.7 billion would be the earmark savings, and the termination of program savings is about $1.25 billion. So we get to that number that's just slightly more than $4 billion. It is perhaps a victory. It's perhaps a success. Perhaps it's a temporary one. I think it's most likely that it is. These cuts that were offered here today will most likely be met with an agreement down on the other end of the Capitol building in the Senate that is run by the Majority Leader Harry Reid of Nevada. I think I saw some language in this appropriations bill that might directly affect him. That might be what helps convince him as well. But, Madam Speaker, this is a short-term piece that was designed to be a period of time that would allow the Senate to mull over the House position, which is H.R. 1. H.R. 1 is the bill that has the highest priority for the Speaker of the House. It's been traditionally the case. And 2 weeks ago, this Congress negotiated, debated, offered amendments. Some 500 to 600 amendments were filed. Nearly 200 of them were debated and voted upon. And many of them that went in that were cuts in spending or prohibitions from using that spending to implement certain policies that have been since rejected by this Congress. And, Madam Speaker, we need to remember that there was an election last November 2nd of 2010. And to quote the President of the United States, he famously said after the election in November 2008, he said, "We had an election and we won," which means that he dictates the policy. Well, Madam Speaker, to the President of the United States, I would say we had an election November 2nd. You didn't win that one, Mr. President. In fact, you declared it to be, I quote, a shellacking, close quote. It was a shellacking. And the Republicans won the majority in this House by huge numbers. We're looking today at 87 new freshman Republicans, 9 freshman Democrats, to give you a sense of the poor proportionality or the disproportionality. The seats that were picked up have dramatically changed. The gavels all changed hands in the House of Representatives. The agenda changed. It has gone from an agenda that's been driven under the speakership of Nancy Pelosi for 4 years, of an agenda of accelerating spending, increasing government, pushing socialized medicine, which is what I have long declared Obamacare to be. That doesn't shock anybody, Madam Speaker. It's common vernacular out in the central part of the United States at a minimum. And so we saw this push to grow government. We saw the President participate in as a United States Senator and accelerate his efforts as the President of the United States in the government takeover. First, promoting a $700 billion TARP bailout program. that was designed to pick up toxic assets that could have been far better picked up by the private sector if he would have just identified them, and we would have exempted capital gains taxes on the profits that would be made. We would have seen private money go in and pick up these toxic mortgages in a large way and be managed for a better result that would have kept more people in their homes. The list of good things goes on that might have happened had we had more free market solutions and less government intervention. But that $700 billion TARP plan was a mistake in my view, Madam Speaker, and behind that came the call for the economic stimulus plan, which was $787.5 billion, that now rolled up to over about around $816 billion in the economic stimulus plan. Not all of it spent, but it was to keep unemployment below 8%. And we know that it sailed up into the upper 9 percentile, 9.7 and above. It's dialed down now to around 9. But we have a lot of people that have given up and stopped trying. And it's clear that the stimulus plan didn't stimulate the economy at all in the way that it was described or the way it was promised to us, but it surely added to the debt. We've seen about $3 trillion in unnecessary spending driven by this president. We watched as proud companies went into hock to the federal government and found the federal government engaged in managing some of those companies. 3 large investment banks taken over by the federal government, at least by the power of management or influence. AIG, the insurance company, over $180 billion that flowed into AIG to protect other investors that had an interest that in AIG, the insurance company, or in policies that they had offered that were guaranteeing the return on mortgage-backed securities, Madam Speaker. So there's $180 billion there, 3 large investment banks, AIG, the insurance company. We saw Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac transition from quasi-government to government, to taxpayer guaranteed, stepping in to play a role in the majority of the mortgage loans in the United States, guaranteed by the taxpayers. I recall standing on this floor, the floor of the House of Representatives in October 26, 2005, listening to the most immediate past chairman of the Financial Services Committee argue that he was never going to participate in bailing out Fannie and Freddie, and if anybody was considering buying stock in either one, they should not do so under the consideration that Barney Frank from Massachusetts would be engaged in bailing them out. And so he later became chairman of the committee, and that's what happened. We saw Dodd-Frank become law, which gives the federal government massive regulatory control over the financial institutions in America. We saw the government, the White House, take over of General Motors and Chrysler. And we saw then Obamacare pass, which I've declared to be the nationalization of our skin and everything inside it. And by the way, it includes a 10% tax on the outside if you go to the tanning salon. That's over 51% of our economy swallowed up by the Obama administration and supported by the Pelosi Congress and the Pelosi House and the Reid Senate. And we come to this point where the America can't take it anymore, Madam Speaker. We can't take it anymore, and all over the world they know that too much spending has put America in debt, and it's put our currency in question, and it's put our economy in an unstable position, and it guarantees that we will be in a long, drawn-out recovery because we have the overspending with the debt to service, which is pay the interest. And then we have to also eventually pay off the principal. And we're borrowing money from the Chinese and begging them, borrowing money from the Saudis and begging them. Yes, it affects our foreign policy. We're watching a foreign policy that's a conflagration in the Middle East. Country after country is blowing up and seeking to throw off the yoke of its long-term dictatorship ruler and replace it with, we're not sure what their ideals are, but they've hit the end of their patience line that's there. And so here we are. Here we are with a continuing resolution that the government's operating on today that was negotiated and passed here in the House and in the Senate in December that extended the funding for the government over until March 4th of this year. midnight, March 4th, which is somewhere around Friday night, I think, maybe Thursday night. And so there's been an action taken here on the floor to pass a continuing resolution to do a temporary stopgap funding to keep the government running for another 2 weeks up until March 18th. And that CR has now been messaged to the Senate, and the Senate can decide if they want to take it up tomorrow or the next day, get it to the President's desk. If the President signs the CR, the government keeps running. If the President doesn't, the government shuts down. And I'm watching as my colleagues seem to think that there's one data point of message for them to learn from, that because there was a government shutdown in 1995, it was one that was pushed for by Republicans, it was driven by Republicans. They wanted to face President Clinton down and insist that they pass a balanced budget and to get to a balanced budget. Well, in spite of all of the things that happened in 1995 and in early 96, that was the result, Madam Speaker, that shortly had a balanced budget. And that balanced budget came a lot sooner than it would have otherwise, and it lasted at least until such time as we were hit by September 11th and the calamity that sent this America into an overspending binge. I think we could have faced the calamity of September 11th without having to blow our budget in the way we did, but that is not what happened. But what did happen in 1995, if that's the only data point, I want to make this point, Madam Speaker, that first of all, there are thousands and thousands of students all over America who are studying political science. Some of them are watching tonight. Some of them are reading in the paper the things we say and we do, and they're analyzing it, and they're listening to their professors analyze what goes on here in Congress, and they're listening to the instruction of the rules, the standards, the axioms that come from certain data points along the line of continuum of political history. And that one data point on that line of continuum of political history is the government shutdown of 1995, and some of it drug over into very early 96. And the argument is that House Republicans lost that because they had to concede their position to the President and to the Senate. Well, it is a fact that the House had to concede. They did concede. It's also a fact that the Republicans that controlled the Senate at the time passed a unanimous consent agreement to go ahead and spend the money that was demanded by Bill Clinton and send it over here to the House. The House was in a position where they couldn't push that chain back uphill, and President Clinton and the Senate got their way and imposed it over the House. But I will still say that there's not a dime that can be spent by the federal government if the House of Representatives insists that it not be spent. We have to concede and go along with it at some point, or it won't be spent. And that the negotiating position that was there for the House Republicans in 1995 was one that was marginally stronger because they had at least a majority in the Senate. That's the difference in the dynamics. But it was also about $300 billion, as I recall, on Medicare spending. And so whenever you put down a dollar figure and you try to stand on that as a principle, it's a different stance than if you put something that is principled down and stand on it. For example, whether we're going to spend $300 billion on Medicare, 1995, or 250 or 200 or 150 or 100 or no more, you will lose or gain people along that line of that continuum. If you want to cut Medicare by $350 billion, you'd lose some people that might be with you at 300. And if you move the line up 400 billion, 450, you lose some people that might have been with you at 350 or 400. Money is something that there's a sliding scale, and you cannot find a principle there that you can stand on. It's like going to an auction and seeing something that you want, and maybe if you go to the auction and you decide, I want to buy a bicycle and I'm willing to pay $100 for that bicycle. If you go to the auction and the auctioneer is crying out, he's got a bid for $100, now he wants $101. Do you pay that extra dollar and go home with the bicycle, something to show for it? Or do you say, no, that was my principle. My principle was I'm not going to spend more than $100. Well, some people live by that principle. I do occasionally. But it's not a principle that's tied to anything. that is definable from a sense of right and wrong. It's a percentage scale. If $100 was the right number, it's only 1% wrong to pay 101. If you get it for 99, do you have any more virtue? No. You just got a bargain from what you anticipated. But when you stand on a principle, it's a different story. The principle here that's better for the House to stand on than the principle of the $300 billion in 1995 is the principle that we must not be funding Obamacare willfully with appropriations bills here in the House. We must not do so because every Republican and a handful of Democrats, and there will be more, voted to repeal Obamacare. We passed the repeal and sent it over to Harry Reid. And furthermore, now that that's happened, every Republican with H.R. 1 has voted to shut off any funding that can be used to implement or enforce Obamacare. That's also a fact. They're principled votes. They aren't votes that are measured on the dollar figure. In fact, most people that voted in that fashion didn't know how much money it actually saved us for voting to repeal Obamacare. And it's hard for me to take a position on that. I'll just say that the chairman of the Budget Committee, Paul Ryan, has used the words about $2.6 trillion is the spending that is saved by repealing Obamacare. That's the best number we have, and I don't disagree with that. I accept that number, but it's hard to come down to something and argue that if we're doing it because of the money savings, did we vote to repeal Obamacare because it would stop the spending of $2.6 trillion? I think not, Madam Speaker. I think that's a part of it. It's part of the equation. We can't afford it, but there are many other principles, and the most important one is Obamacare takes American liberty and puts it into the hands of government to manage the second most sovereign thing we have is our bodies and our health. That's what's wrong with Obamacare. It's the matter of the principle. It's the takings of American liberty that must be stopped. And no, we can't afford it, and it's money that's better spent by doctor-patient relationships and individuals making decisions on their health insurance and moving on down the line with those conservative principles. But we need to stand on principle. And we have this opportunity here in this 112th Congress to stand on principle. And the stance needs to be that we will not vote to fund Obamacare. And I'm going to add to this that neither shall we vote to fund Planned Parenthood. And I shall be looking for ways to unfund every other entity like them that promotes abortion or provides abortion as a matter of practice in their facilities. Planned Parenthood is invested in promiscuity. That's a longer discussion than I'll engage in tonight, Madam Speaker. But I think these two issues are tied very closely together going forward, that Obamacare funding must be shut off, and we cannot be asking our members to vote again to appropriate funds that can be used to fund Obamacare. And some will be saying, we didn't have Obamacare funding in this short-term CR. As they said, there wasn't Obamacare funding in the CR that passed at the end of December that takes us to the 4th of March. But here's the answer to this. There are at least 21 different components to Obamacare that are beneficiaries of funding that goes into the various departments that there's no prohibition for that money from being going into for being used to implement or enforce Obamacare. At least 21 different areas. And when you look at the money that's in there, we discovered altogether the automatic appropriations, something like $4.9 billion that went into for the balance of this year. They were automatically appropriated. That's not prohibited in this CR. We didn't get it into H.R. 1 actually either. But the 21 programs are there, and the money's there for them, and I can roll those into the record, Madam Speaker, but there's another component of this that is a blanket component, and that is language in Obamacare that gives the authority to the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Kathleen Sebelius, to do intra-departmental transfers so that she can use that money to implement and enforce Obamacare at her discretion. And we failed to shut that language off too. So this appropriations bill that passed today, H.J. Res. 44, the 2-week CR, has 21 places in it that fund Obamacare. And it still allows for the Secretary of Health and Human Services to take intra-departmental transfers to use at her discretion at will, which funds Obamacare. And the Pence language, the Pence amendment that he's worked on so valiantly and so long to shut off all funding to Planned Parenthood was passed by this House in H.R. 1. It became a component of the position of the House that was delivered here about 4:30 on a Saturday morning, a week ago last Saturday morning. Those components, I believe, need to be part of everything we do going forward. And I will stand and promote those, and I'll stand with those who will stand for life. I simplify it when I say the Pence language that shuts off funding to Planned Parenthood, but there are other components that also were left out, and that's the Dornan Amendment, which prohibits funding for abortions in D.C. The Mexico City policy, which we've always done, not part of it. That shuts off funding to abortions in foreign lands. The International Population Control and Family Planning Fund gets money still, along with Planned Parenthood. This is what's taken place, Madam Speaker, in this short-term CR. And boy, it's hard for many members to vote for it. They want to be team players. And I appreciate that sentiment. From my standpoint, I have an obligation to my constituents and to God and country to do the best job I can to serve. And it goes in the opposite order. God, country, constituents right up there with country, and sometimes the best interests of my district are not always going to be the best interest of America. I haven't had that conflict that I can articulate yet, but if that comes, I'm pretty confident my constituents will understand the priority. We have to do the right thing for the long term for our country, and the right thing is for us to stand on principle and to shut off this funding to Obamacare, shut off this funding to Planned Parenthood, and make sure that we are standing on a solid, moral, principled ground, and that we've got a firm place that we can then negotiate those things that are negotiable with the Senate, which, by the way, is a proxy for the President of the United States. So if it can be negotiated with the President, it's also negotiated, or with the Senate, it's also negotiated with the President, in my view. But I want to also add this, and in a moment I'm going to look forward to yielding to my friend from Texas who's just arrived on the floor. But for weeks now, the Democrats in the House and the Democrats in the Senate have been clamoring for a government shutdown. They seem to be determined to shut the government down. They seem to think that if there's a government shutdown, they're going to win that debate, and they're going to maybe pick up seats in the House and pick up seats in the Senate, and they'll be able to impose their government growth, government spending, expansion of debt proposals that they've been pushing for the last 4 years that has failed, that the American people have rejected. And we should not be deluded into believing that Democrats somehow want to go through this period of fiscal austerity. They want to drive this spending up, and they want to have more excuses for increasing taxes. If government grows and taxes grow, at some point the taxes grow to the point where they consume everything, and then those business entities that I talked about being taken over by this White House become the small part of a long list of business entities that are taken over. I've spoken of this before. On the website, the socialist website, they say, we don't want to nationalize everything like the communists. We're just socialists. We only want to nationalize the Fortune 500 companies. Thanks a lot. Give the barber and the butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker some relief. Thanks a lot for that. And then they want to manage the Fortune 500 companies, quote, for the benefit of the people affected by them, close quote. That's the unions. And the President handed shares in General Motors and Chrysler over to the unions, who had no skin in the game, no equity invested, and he handed it over to them anyway. It's right off the socialist website, and the progressives that are left in this Congress adhere to the agenda of the socialists on the website. But Democrats that are clamoring for a shutdown fail to understand that the American people are more sophisticated today than they were in 1995. They've seen this movie before, and they fear it ends with Republicans giving in to the demands of tax consumers. I have that same fear, but I'm encouraging all of us on this side of the aisle and those discerning Democrats that remain, and there are some, to join with us in putting an end to Obamacare, putting an end to funding for Planned Parenthood, putting an end to overspending. Let's get serious about real cuts. Let's get serious about holding the line. When every Republican in the House voted to repeal Obamacare and every Republican voted to unfund Obamacare, then by golly, that's our obligation. That's what we must do. That's what we shall do. Madam Speaker, I'd be happy to yield to the gentleman from Texas, my friend, Judge Gomer.
And I thank my friend from Iowa. I've been listening to your well-thought-out comments. This is a serious time, not just in American history, but in world history. And it's a little difficult to get beat up from our friends from the other side of the aisle over what's going on right now, over a continuing resolution, when there's one reason we're doing any continuing resolution. It's because they didn't do their job last year. This was supposed to have been done last year. They didn't do it. Why? I guess they were concerned that if people saw exactly a budget that's required by law that wasn't done last year, just ignored that, just like the president's now going to ignore the Defense of Marriage Act. I didn't know presidents could pick and choose the laws that were duly passed and signed into law and just say, we don't choose to defend that anymore. But to get beat up by people across the aisle over what's going on is a little tough to take, because they didn't do their job. Now we're having to do it. And then to further get beat up over spending issues because we're trying to cut spending. And I know my friend from Iowa, as I did, voted no on the CR today because it didn't continue the hard-fought battle that was won in H.R. 1, where we were defunding Obamacare. But I recall in 2005, 2006, my first term in Congress, getting beat up, figuratively speaking, by friends across the aisle because they said rightfully we were spending too much money, and that we were going to run, $100 to $200 billion in deficit over the amount we were going to receive in, and that was irresponsible. Well, they were right. We shouldn't have been spending $100 to $200 billion more than we were getting in 05 and 06. They said we were spending too much. They were right. And what happened in November of 06, they had promised they would get the spending under control. If they were given the majority, they got the majority. And they immediately started spending more than we had spent. And so here we are after a Democratic president gets elected promising hope and change. And people didn't realize that the change was going to be the few pennies left in their pockets after this government was spending so much and leaving little that banks can loan for new businesses and small businesses to hire people. So the economy's struggling. This government has sucked up all the capital that there is to create jobs and to get the economy going. So one of the things that's troubled me is hearing people complaining about wanting to cut hundreds of billions of dollars. In fact, trying to cut $1.5 trillion of the president's proposed $3.65 trillion budget, 3.7. It's over. We're only supposed to get in about $2.16 trillion total of all federal revenue, and this president's proposing a budget that's $1.65 trillion more than that. So I keep wondering, since our Democratic friends across the aisle were beating up on us in 06 for spending too much money, what would be wrong with saying not cut $100 billion, but cut $1.65 trillion, and let's get back to where we were in 06. That was only $200 billion over what we were receiving. What would be wrong with going? The Democrats were right. Republicans were spending too much money in 05 and 06. What would be wrong with going back to that budget? And yet here, there's all this rancor over just cutting $100 billion. And the president's talking $1.65 trillion, more than we received in. I don't know if my friend from Iowa